Hello, everyone, and welcome to DEED 705, Applied Psychology of Learning. This is our first lecture of the semester where we will be exploring contemporary psychological principles and theories of learning with particular emphasis on their empirical foundations and the application to teaching and learning processes in developmental, adult learning, and higher education contexts. So as we begin 2026, we find that we are at a fascinating intersection of contemporary and classical theories. And so that's what we're going to be talking about in this lecture. And this is our course introduction. We're going to be looking at contemporary perspectives in learning theory tonight. I am Dr. Jackson, your instructor of record for the course. I'm an associate professor and an endowed professor in the College of Education, the Department of Developmental and Higher Education Studies. And again, I would like to welcome you to the course. So today's doctoral scholars, such as yourself, you're learning in a unique way. Your learning psychology faces unique challenges. We find ourselves at a very fascinating intersection of classical learning theory and emerging technological frontiers. You're not just going to be studying how people learn. You're going to be examining learning in an era where artificial intelligence tutors students, where global classrooms exist in the metaverse, and where the distinction between digital and physical learning spaces continues to blur. Even right now, you're in a digital virtual learning space, much different from what the classical theorists such as Bandura and Skinner and Pavlov and Vygotsky would be familiar with. Can you just imagine B.F. Skinner observing a student navigating virtual reality, or Vygotsky analyzing learning in global digital communities? Think about their theories, what you know about those theories. How would those theories evolve? And I just like to pause right here and say that while this course will be examining more contemporary theories, we will also rely on classical theories as the foundation for what we do and what we learn and how we learn in this course. So while the focus transitions from classical theories, I will include specific resources on Canvas, review resources related to learning theories that you would have talked about in a human growth and development course in your master's program, or even in your undergrad program if you are from that field. So there will be some review materials there, but we're going to be focusing more so on contemporary perspectives related to learning and how students learn and learning theory. And so in this course, we'll journey from behaviorism, which is one of the early classical learning theories, to connectivism, which is a more contemporary theory that has come about within the last 20 years. But we're going to have a critical lens or a critical eye that asks very specific questions, such as how do timeless principles of learning psychology apply in contemporary contexts? What remains constant in human learning, and what truly was transformed or is transforming with technology? And most importantly, how can we, as educators and professionals in the field, harness both classical wisdom and modern innovation to create more effective and equitable learning environments for all students? You know, in our doctoral program in developmental and higher education studies, our focus is on student success. And we need to be able to ensure the success of today's student. You know, the term developmental education is really growing out of fashion, if you will. It is more of an antiquated term. We no longer use that term when referring to students, non-traditional or otherwise, who may need a little assistance. We now focus on student success for all students. And today's learner needs new and innovative ways to ensure that that happens. And so that's what we're going to be doing in this course. That's what we'll be covering in this course. So I want you to begin with a little thought experience. If you have your device, if you have a phone or your tablet or an iPad or a laptop, take that out and think about what you know about Piaget, Jean Piaget, or Albert Bandura, Ivan Pavlov. You may remember Pavlov from one of your earlier psychology courses, and his experiment with the dogs, that sort of learning there. Think about them and try to explain in your mind how these tools, such as your cell phone or whatever you have, how have those tools transformed not just how we access information, but how we actually construct knowledge itself? There's maybe a bit of a tension there from those more classical or classically trained educators and the more contemporary modern practice. There may be a tension between the foundational theory and the modern or contemporary theory. That feeling that you have there between classical and contemporary, how classical fits with contemporary, how that tension interacts, that's what we're going to be doing. That's what we'll be covering, and that's what we'll be exploring this semester. So if you're up for the challenge, if you're ready to challenge assumptions, but also ready to see the opportunities that await you as professionals in the fields of student success with non-traditional learners. And keep in mind that anybody can be a learner. We have organizational psychologists who design learning programs for huge corporations and organizations, right along with instructors in elementary classrooms who design instruction for their babies, and at the college level as well. So if you're ready for that challenge, to challenge assumptions, to build your theoretical knowledge base, to bridge theoretical divides, and perhaps even contribute to the next evolution of learning theory, then let's jump right on in to our lecture. All right, so first, let's look at the evolution of learning theory, starting with the earliest of learning theories, which is behaviorism. You know, learning theories, as I said previously, have undergone a significant transformation since their formal inception in psychology and education. And to understand where we are right now, we must first appreciate and acknowledge the journey of theoretical development, while recognizing that these transitions weren't simply linear, but rather cumulative expansions of understanding. So the evolutionary path, as I said, it begins with behaviorism, which, if you want a point of reference, the 1900s to the 1950s. Behaviorism focuses on observable behavior rather than internal mental states. Some of the key theorists would be those that I just mentioned previously: Pavlov, Skinner, Watson, et cetera. Ivan Pavlov, you know, he was famous for classical conditioning theory. The dogs demonstrated that it was demonstrated through his famous dog experiments, showing how a stimuli can be associated with a natural response. You know, the bell in the dog, or a simple, you know, dogs got used to hearing the bell, knowing it was time to eat. They associated food with a stimuli. And then we have B.F. Skinner with operant conditioning, and he introduced the concepts of reinforcement and punishment in shaping behavior. And remember, all of this, some information about this will be included on Canvas, more details, just in case you've not looked at these theories in many years, or you may have forgotten about these theories. I have some review materials on Canvas. Watson emphasized the role of environment in behavior, famous for the little Albert experiments. And I'll let you guys use your new modes of learning, the internet and AI, to learn about the little Albert experiments. Behaviorists, they view learning as a change in observable behavior, as I said, caused by external stimuli in the environment. Behaviorist traditions of Skinner and Watson provided the field's very first systematic approach to understanding learning. While this might seem sort of reductionist to you modern scholars. You reduced learning to such a small and infinite or finite activity. It did give crucial insights into reinforcement and conditioning that we still apply to learning today, particularly in educational technology and adaptive learning systems. The work of behaviorists continues to influence all educational practices, particularly in classroom management strategies, behavior modification techniques, programmed instruction, and educational software design. So behaviorism still plays a role today. The next iteration of learning theory was cognitivism. And that came about in the 1950s, if you need a point of reference, 1950s to 1960s. Theorists like Bruner and Ausubel opened the black box, so to speak, of mental processes. Remember, behaviorism looked at things that we could observe, not really giving much thought to what's going on internally, what mental processes are going on internally. Cognitivism began to look at those mental processes with regard to learning. And that helped us to understand how learners process, how they store, and how they retrieve information. This cognitive revolution, if you will, laid the groundwork for many current digital learning designs. Cognitivism emerged as psychologists became more interested in how we're thinking, what those mental processes are that underlie behavior, what's going on internally, the mental component of behavior. And some of those notable theorists are Albert Bandura. Brunner introduced discovery learning and the importance of cognitive structure in learning. Albert Bandura developed social cognitive learning theory, emphasizing observational learning and self-efficacy. And if some of you have a counseling background, you might be familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, the cognitive and the behavior, first two learning theories combined. You'll find that a lot of what we do in our program in student success, in developmental education, has a lot of overlap with counseling psychology, learning theory, applied behavior, applied psychology of learning, student development theory, and counseling theory. There's a bit of overlap, quite a bit of overlap, and you'll begin to see why that is in this course. And then we also have Robert Gagne, which is one of the authors that you'll be reading about this week, or reading from this week, in this module rather, created the 9 events of instruction. Very important component that you'll be looking at in this module. And those 9 events of instruction again, bridge behaviorism and cognitivism. So very important that you are aware of how cognitivists view people and how they learn. They examine how people process information. They are concerned about those mental processes. They are concerned about how people form memories. Because you think about a lot of learning is memory or memorization. How people solve problems, how they make decisions. All of those things are quite quite important and to the cognitivists. And they also use how people they look at how people make mental models. So that's cognitivism. As we move on this evolution of learning theory, we come to constructivism. And constructivism, for a point of reference, 1960s to the present, constructivism views learning as an active process where learners construct or build new understanding based on prior knowledge and experience. And some of the key figures in constructivism are Piaget. You may have heard of Jean Piaget, Lev Vygotsky, and David Ausubel. So Piaget developed cognitive development theory, introducing stages of development. So we'll learn about those stages of development. And you may see that there's a bit of overlap when you get to if you have not already had theories of student development, if that is your area, if your option area is student development personnel services, you'll take a course called Theories of Student Development, and you'll learn different ways that how students grow and how they develop. And so Jean Piaget was first in that regard with his cognitive development theory, introducing stages of development and concepts of assimilation and accommodation. Lev Vygotsky introduced social constructivism, and you may have heard of the zone of proximal development. Some of these terms, I'm hoping if you've had a psychology course before or a human growth and development course, some of these terms are, sounding familiar to you. So that was Lev Vygotsky. David Ausubel emphasized the importance of meaningful learning and cognitive structures. Some of the constructivist principles are active knowledge construction, social interaction in learning, contextual learning, scaffolding, and authentic learning experiences. That the constructivist movement revealed learning as an active social process of meaning making. It's social and is active. It's not a passive activity as maybe was thought of in the behaviorist or cognitivism context. These foundational theories, all of them, continue to evolve and inform modern educational practices, particularly as they adapt to digital learning environments and new understandings of how people learn. This shift fundamentally changed how we view the learner's role from passive receiver to active constructor of knowledge. So let's talk about our integration to modern learning. And I know you might think that, well, learning is learning. You're going to learn whether it's 1900 or 2025 or 2026. But the way in which people learn, the way in which knowledge is constructed does indeed evolve. So with regard to integration in modern learning, contemporary learning environments often integrate the elements from all three of the previously mentioned theories: behaviorism, cognitivism, and constructivism. Behaviorist principles are seen in feedback and reinforcement systems. Cognitive strategies are for information processing and problem solving, and constructivist approaches are for collaborative and experiential learning. So in our contemporary connected age, you see the next theory there, this connected age, these constructivist principles have evolved into theories of connected learning or connectivism, where knowledge construction occurs within complex networks of people, resources, and technologies. So some of the key theoretical shifts: traditional learning theories typically viewed learning as an individual cognitive process following a relatively linear progression. The standardized approaches that emerged from this perspective assumed relatively uniform learning pathways. However, contemporary models and contemporary understanding shows us that there are several critical insights that challenge the assumptions of the foundational theoretical frameworks. So think about an individual to networked learning. Today's learners operate within very complex networks of information and social connections. There's the World Wide Web. Information is always readily accessible. There's social networks. We all know about those social networks. And I don't just mean social networks like your Instagram and TikTok, but LinkedIn and places where they get information. And also you do get your news. I know most of us get our news from social media, social networks. Learning isn't just about individual cognitive processes, but involves navigation and participation in these networks. And this shift requires us to reconsider how we design learning experiences and what constitutes effective learning. We are moved from a linear to adaptive progression. Modern learning theories recognize that learning pathways are rarely linear. Instead, they're often recursive, they're interconnected, and highly personalized. So When you think about connectivism, there's digital networks, there are adaptive systems that as I just indicated. And then there's the global collaboration, where there's a lot of collaborating of learners from various points on the globe, from all over the world. It's not just in a single classroom. You guys are working together in a class, but you aren't necessarily in the same corners of the earth. You may be in different parts of the world. You may be from varying backgrounds, and you're collaborating together. And some of the major players, and two of which that we're going to talk about, are George Simmons and Stephen Downes, and they are from 2006, just 20 years ago to the present. So that's how learning theory has evolved. So let's look at the learning theory integration framework. So you have traditional theories along with digital technology and contemporary needs, all feeding into modern integration that yields networked learning, adaptive systems, personalized paths, and an equity focus. So when you think about those personalized paths, contemporary learning theory emphasizes the importance of personalization. While traditional approaches such as behaviorism and constructivism, cognitivism sought to standardize education for efficiency, current perspectives recognize the necessity of adapting to individual learner characteristics. And that includes incorporating prior knowledge and experience, hence experiential learning, cultural background that leads to that equity focus, learning preference, personal goals and motivations, access to resources and technology. All of those are a part of how we're going to integrate traditional theories into a more networked learning adaptive system that includes personalized paths with an equity focus. So some of the contemporary learning components, you're going to have digital networks, social platforms, adaptive tools, cultural integration, and universal design. And when you think about that, contemporary learning theory must now address digital literacy and competency. We have to address the information abundance via social platforms and be able to evaluate that effectively. We got to look at remote and hybrid learning environments, those types of adaptive tools, cultural responsiveness and inclusion with regard to cultural integration, and technological equity and access, along with global connectivity and collaboration. All of those things are critical components of contemporary learning, modern learning. And so let's kind of look at the comparison here again, just to reiterate where we were traditionally and where we are trying to move to in a contemporary environment. In the traditional sense, there was fixed content. In the contemporary learning environment or learning theory, must have adaptive content. The content has to be able to adapt to learner needs. Traditionally, there was a single perspective. In the contemporary sense, we have multiple voices. And that is critically important. In the traditional sense, there was standard delivery. In the more contemporary environment, there are personalized paths. Traditionally, learning was teacher-centered. And now it is, in the more contemporary respect, it's learner-centered. Before we get into the OER impact, let's talk about the digital age. The digital revolution, because that's where we are. We are in the digital age. The digital revolution hasn't necessarily just changed how we deliver education. It has fundamentally altered how we understand learning itself. Some of the key impacts include immediate access to vast information sources. There's so much information that is readily accessible right at your fingertips. Multiple modes of representation and engagement. There's real-time feedback and assessment. AI has made that possible. Collaborative learning is now can be done at scale. Everyone can learn together all at the same time. all over the world. Adaptive and personalized learning paths. We keep reiterating that. And artificial intelligence and learning analytics. That is one of the ways that some of the ways that the digital age has impacted learning. Another way is OER, open educational resources. You have an open educational resource in this course. It is a freely accessible textbook, which increases equity. Everybody has access to that book on the very first day of class. We don't have to wait until you are able to purchase it. It's ready for you. There's adaptable content. With open educational resources, those resources can be remixed, they can be reused, they can be updated, they can be adapted to any context as needed. They can be customized. There's a global reach. Open educational resources are free to whomever can get on the internet and access it, which is just about everyone today. There's a cultural exchange that's possible. It's innovative and it can introduce new methods. So that's the OER impact and part of the digital age impact that is happening now, that is influencing how people learn. So some of the theoretical implications, if you think about theory, knowledge construction, and learning design, theory now must also look at collaborative learning via multiple perspectives when considering how knowledge is constructed and how learning is designed. You want to have a universal design that includes practices that are inclusive, that are not just linear and for one type of student. You want to have practices that are inclusive for all students, whether they are learning disabled or on the autism spectrum, or they may have other hidden disabilities, and they too deserve to learn. And that's something that we've done in developmental education since its inception. We focus on student success for all students, helping students, undergraduates in particular, realize their greatest potential. So some challenges and opportunities with regard to contemporary learning theories. Modern learning theory must address several challenges, several critical challenges. And there are also some new opportunities that are available as well. With regard to challenges, if you think about the digital divide, there must be an assurance that there's equitable access to technology and resources. That's a challenge, particularly for rural areas, persons who may not be able to access all of the knowledge that is there. Information overload, a real challenge. There's so much information available. How do we harness that and provide access to it in such a way that it's beneficial to students? Developing effective information processing strategies. And how do we help students to develop those effective information processing strategies? Transfer, that's another challenge. We have to have a way to support the application of learning across various contexts. How can learning be transferred? Assessment, another challenge. Creating authentic evaluation in a digital environment that is AI proof and that will require students to use their critical thinking skills. And motivation, maintaining engagement in distributed learning settings. How do you maintain that engagement? How do you keep your students engaged so that they can be successful and they can learn the information? But along with challenges, there are always opportunities. And so some of the opportunities, there's the opportunity for global collaboration, connecting learners across boundaries, which is really important. And that goes back to some of the constructivism, aspects of constructivism, such as social learning. And this just is social learning on a global scale. And so that is a real opportunity that we can harness. Another opportunity is the opportunity for personalized learning, tailoring experiences to individual needs. You can give real-time assessment and real-time feedback, providing immediate formative feedback. Some other opportunities, adaptive systems, creating responsive learning environments, and universal design, developing inclusive learning experiences. So this contemporary landscape, it really requires us to think differently about how we design, how we implement, and how we evaluate learning experiences as professionals in student success. As doctoral scholars, your challenge is to integrate these perspectives while developing new theoretical insights that address current and emerging educational needs. As education has evolved into the digital age, when we talked about connectivism, it specifically addresses how people learn in a networked environment. While traditional learning theories focus on individual cognitive processes or social interactions in physical spaces, connectivism recognizes that learning now flows through digital networks and connections. So that's something that you really need to consider as you are working your way through your projects in this course, through the major assignments of this course, through your discussions and other assignments. Keep the foundational principles at the forefront of your mind, but also consider how new and emerging theories are impacted by the state of the world that we are in currently, how today's learner can be most effectively served as we design learning for today's learner. So you're going to be reading some material this week, a couple of studies, some reading assignments in this module that kind of go over some of the foundational materials, how we learn, how people grow, and also you'll be reading about some of the new emerging theoretical frameworks, particularly connected learning or connectivism. Looking to the future, connectivism will likely continue to evolve as new information reservoirs emerge and technology advances. Educational designers, educational leaders, professionals in the field of student success must focus on improving e-learning content quality while maintaining pedagogical effectiveness and rigor. The integration of mobile learning technologies presents, as I said, both challenges and opportunities for connected learning. But this evolution of learning theory reflects how education has adapted to meet the needs of learners. And so if you look at the connectivism network, you have the learner who has digital resources, social networks, online communities, which create their knowledge network, which in turn produces new learning for the learner. So that's how that connectivism network, if you were to look at it pictorially, this is what it would look like. So when you connect classical wisdom with contemporary learning, you think about your classical theory, and then digital innovation, cultural integration, and future directions. This evolution of learning theory reflects how education has adapted over the years to meet the needs of learners in an increasingly digital world, while maintaining connections to foundational educational principles. Connectivism, which is going to be a focus of our course, provides a framework for understanding and designing learning experiences that leverage the power of digital networks and our many social connections. So that kind of gives an overview of what we're going to be doing this year. Module 1, you'll have several reading assignments. You'll participate in a live forum. You'll also participate in an asynchronous forum. And all due dates for the assignments as well as instructions and all of that can be found on Canvas. Make sure that you are accessing Canvas, if at all possible, from a laptop or a desktop computer, because that is the best way to see all of the materials that are available to you. when you are in a module, it is not advisable to just simply click on assignments and go straight to the assignments, because when you do that, you miss all of the information, things such as video lectures like this one, or printed lectures that will be uploaded, special instructions for assignments. So make sure that you are using or accessing Canvas using the appropriate digital learning tool. Also, we will be communicating via email. You will be receiving email to your university issued GSU student email account. So ensure that you are able to access that. If you have any difficulty, please shoot me an email and I'll try to assist you as best I can. But that concludes our brief lecture for tonight. I hope that you all have learned something and this has kind of sparked your thinking as you reflect on the traditional learning theories of Bandura and Pavlov and others, and as you connect those theories to the more contemporary learning theories of connectivism and connected learning. Until next time, this is Dr. Jackson. I hope you have a great evening and we'll chat soon.